Katalina, lovely to have you with us.
Great to be here.
Now, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was born in Tonga, brought up in New Zealand and Australia, mostly in Australia, and brought up in the Uniting Church.
Fantastic. Tell me about your theological formation.
Well, I was born into the church. That's what it is for Pacific Islanders, for Tongans specifically. You know, you're born into the church, so you don't know anything else but that. But really, my formation as a Christian was in the Uniting Church, as a young person, and so faith life was completely part of, my upbringing. And going into ministry, I always say that I was destined to be in ministry before I was even born, because that was just the way it is. Family life, community life, village life, absolutely integral, in the faith journey of individual Tongans. So.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about that in terms of the Tongan worship. What are the distinctives for you in terms of what makes it Tongan worship?
I think for Tongans, the most distinctive thing about worship is the sacredness of the space and entering into holy ground. While for Tongans, worshipping God is something that you do every place, every minute of every day of your life, private and public. But there's a specific time that we come together as a community, as the people of God, in a specific space. And it's very holy and very sacred. And the sense of that sacred space, because you're entering into the presence of God. Like God is meant to be everywhere, all over, all the time, but there's a specific time where you're entering into God's presence as a community. Okay. So that act, public act, is very special.
So in a sense, you're saying that it's both the sense of holiness, which is very much a Methodist perspective as well.
Probably, yeah.
Kind of a Methodist connection.
But it fits in well with Tongan cultural traditions and customs as well.
So in some ways, the missionaries were able to link those two things. So to what they brought with Christianity and then the existing culture that was there.
I believe so. I think that's why Christianity took on very well in Tonga.
So how did Christianity get to Tonga?
Comprehensive way. Missionaries.
Okay.
Specifically British and Australian. The Methodist Church is the state church, so we were a district of the Methodist Church in Australasia.
Oh, okay. So in a sense, it was a really close bond then between Australasia and Tonga in terms of how the Methodist Church worked.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in terms of that, has there been change in the Methodist Church of Tonga over time in terms of how worship is done, or is it largely the same?
It's largely the same. There's a set liturgy that we use, and it's been introduced to the Tongans, I believe, by the missionaries, and we continue to use that to this day.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so would that include things like the hymn book and that as well?
And just, the elements of the liturgy and how we pray and we sing.
Because I found it interesting when I was in Tonga that in the hymns, for example, someone would recite the hymn first, and then you'd sing the verse, and then someone would recite the hymn.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why does that happen?
It's an oratory culture, Oratory is a huge thing in our customs and traditions, and to be able, it's almost like you're sermonizing, you're proclaiming theology in the hymns, and when you're saying it, you're not just reading it, you're actually proclaiming something,
So in a sense then, almost the hymns become another mini sermon.
Absolutely.
Rather than just singing, like often happens in the Palangi environment where we sing, but no one's really caring what the words are. Yeah. This is a different situation.
And it's very inclusive in the sense that, young, old, men, women can read the hymn, so you're given those kinds of responsibility as a community. And so you get to, not just have that mini experience of, proclaiming the word, but it's very, it gets into the blood,
Okay,
for the person, but the whole community experiences with you the words and the theology that comes through, you know.
and then you can sing it communally
Yeah,
again
and then the
after
singing just tops it all off, you know.
Okay. So what you said there was interesting in that the person who reads the hymn in terms of each verse as it goes through can be done by anyone.
Yes.
So therefore it's a way in which lay people can be
Yes.
included in the
Yes,
role of the
absolutely.
service.
That's what I meant.
Okay.
The inclusiveness of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, generally, are lay people encouraged to do things like lead worship and preach in the Tongan tradition?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's probably a Methodist thing as well. I mean, but we have, for Tongans to be given that responsibility is an honor and a privilege. So everyone would, you know, is looking forward to being called in that way, you know, to preach, to lead worship, but preaching especially, you know. So it's taken very seriously as a responsibility. Yeah, so everyone who feels a call to lay preaching, it's a communal process as well. You know, the gifts and graces in that way are identified by the community, and you're encouraged and, you know, nurtured through a process.
Okay, so there is training then for people who lead worship?
Yeah, in the Tongan system these days, it's pretty informal, but because faith life is such a whole life journey, from when you're born all the way through, like myself, you know, I just went through every bit of my journey was within the church and in the different ministries, you know, from being a Sunday school kid to being a Sunday school teacher, youth leader, you know, being involved in the life of the church in that way. All of that is part of the formation. Yeah. And so you get to a point where you feel confident that you can begin to lead worship. So we become, I'm trying to think of the English word for lot fehui. It's someone who's learning, you know, to lead worship, to be a preacher.
So kind of like a probationer.
Yeah, that's it. That's the word I was looking for.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in a sense then what you're saying is that it's less about formal education and more about kind of in-service training.
Yeah,
is kind of or in-life training in the process of vocational process. Okay. So how has that changed now in the Tongan diaspora? So as the Tongans come to places like Australia and New Zealand where you grew up, is it different here?
No.
So it's really the same. It still fits the same process.
Yeah, it's the similar. Having to juggle all the other, you know, demands on a person who's trying to make a life in a Western context is added to the mix, you know. And so we have young people issues, you know, intergenerational stuff, all thrown into the mix. But still, the process is the same.
Okay.
You know?
Is that? I mean, one of the things that often happens for especially second generation and third generation is the loss of some language.
Yes.
Because, of course, living in a different language environment.
Yeah.
How does the Tongan worship context deal with that?
Yeah. Well, in the diasporic context, many of our diasporic Tongan communities are even more adamant about the Tongan language, you know. It alienates some young people, and I just think that that's because the parents hadn't done their job to ensure that that the kids are bilingual, because it's totally possible. It was my upbringing, you know. I spent most of my life in a Western context, but my parents were very clear that I have to be literate in my Tongan culture and my language, and be able to speak English very well as well. So I think it's possible, and many kids are brought up that way, but not all of the kids. So some are alienated because we insist on having that language in our Tongan communities in the West. But a lot of the programs in the church in the West, the Tongan churches, are very much Tongan, you know, focused in terms of the language, because many of our elders think that this is the only way to maintain the language. If the parents are not doing it at home, then we have to do it at church.
Okay.
So it is alienating in some ways,
yeah.
But some people like myself totally believe it's important to maintain some of those issues because it's essential for our cultural identity.
Okay. So in a sense, for what you're saying is that the connection between language and culture, and particularly language as the vehicle of culture, is what's important for the Tongan context.
Absolutely, and absolutely in a faith community, you know, where to be able to engage and to communicate theologically, you know, biblically, and culturally in that context, because it's really hard for us to separate the two, you know, culture and faith are so integral. So, and our traditions and, you know, the stories of our ancestors, that's really important for us and for long-term survival in the Western context.
Okay.
I totally believe it.
Well, in terms of that though, are there some Tongan communities that have English services?
Not that I know of.
Okay, so it's really fairly uniformly Tongan in terms of it. So, in that regard, then, I mean, where would you find resources for developing worship within the Tongan context? Do you have to make them up each time? Because a lot of the resources would be English resources.
Yeah, but like I said, you know, Tongans, and the majority of us that are here are still predominantly first generation, who have all of that knowledge and experience here and here. You know, so our church communities just run automatically because we know how to do it, you know, and we know the hymns, and, you know, we know the Bible because I read the Tongan Bible back to back by the time I was 6, you know. So it's that kind of, not everyone is like that anymore, but, you know, we still have enough pool of Tongans in a Western context to just run our churches and do worship in the way that we always know, you know, and have done. Of course, you know, younger generations like myself are striving to be bicultural so that we can include the ones who are brought up here and, you know, not very good with the Tongan language or understanding of the Tongan culture, you know. So easily, like in my role, I do it all the time. You know, I'm the one who try to teach the, you know, a more biculturally aware liturgy and worship. I translate materials. I run a lot of workshops and training with Tongans and other cultures, but, you know, with Tongans to help in that way.
Okay. So you are translating some of the, I suppose, like things like Uniting in Worship 2 and those kind of things into Tongan.
Yeah.
Okay. And how's that received? How is that received? Is it received well, or would people rather have maybe what they were used to in terms of the Methodist liturgical frame?
Yeah, well, the preference is for the Methodist liturgical thing, but, you know, I put a lot of time into, you know, helping them understand this is part of what we need to do if we want to continue to nurture and include the younger generation that are starting to drift and, you know.
Okay. Now, in terms of that, one of the things that young people quite enjoy, they enjoy, you know, music that's got maybe a slightly different beat to the Methodist hymn books beat. How do you cope with that in a Tongan context?
I think part of, I mean, you've been to Tongan services, right? And when Tongans sing, it's rousing regardless of what music it is, you know? So
what you're saying, it's the internal passion that makes the difference, not the music itself.
Well, we love the music, you know, and just singing is such a natural rhythmic part of who we are, you know. I mean, young people would like more instruments, of course, and, you know, and those are the kinds of things we try to incorporate as some changes in the development of worship in Tongan communities. So there's more instrumental, you know, support for the the passionate vocal, you know, thing. But in a Tongan community, I would never feel that, you know, music is less than vibrant and reckless and passionate.
Even if it is the older hymns.
Oh, exactly.
Okay.
You know, even if it's the older ones, you know, it's more like an appeal to you know, contemporary modern style of, you know, making music that drives the younger generation that wants other things to be involved.
Now, are young women and young people encouraged to be part of that whole process, or is it still more a men-led thing? We're pretty hierarchical and patriarchal, but as a young Tongan, I'd never had any, you know, never had any issues, you know. I never felt that I was blocked in my progress as a young Christian in my own Tongan community. And I'm not sure if that's just specifically because the leadership that was around at the time were more
open and nurturing and, wanting to encourage young people like myself, young women like me. Or maybe it was just my personality.
But in some ways, I suppose it's about leadership, isn't it? About being able to put yourself out there to be able to take leadership positions as much as. But there was opportunity for you to be able to do that, and you feel that there is that opportunity.
Yeah, and there were many female leaders in my community at the time too, including my parents. My mum.
And so I suppose you had good role models then to work from. Yeah. Now, in terms of that, what do you see as the future of Tongan worship? I mean, what is the future in the sense of the Tongan church, both within Tonga, but also here now within the diaspora?
Yeah. I think it'll continue in this quite traditional way. And for us in the diaspora, it's critical. It's a critical part of formation, Christian formation for a younger generation. But it's also cultural. There are a lot of cultural elements through our worshiping that helps form young people culturally and, in a faith aspect. But with the younger generation, there's bound to be dramatic changes as well.
In which direction do you think those might happen?
Probably more modernistic, Western bent than,
Okay, so maybe taking on some of the Western cultural norms, maybe connecting with some of those a bit more.
What I'm trying to do is to help younger Tongans to be biculturally literate, so that we don't lose the traditional elements that are really critical and important for us to maintain, but inject the Western stuff that are good as well, because not all the Western stuff are appealing and helpful either.
No.
So
but kind of finding that blend in terms of the process. Do you think that there's because a lot of the Tongan churches, as you say, because they are in Tongan, means that they often will be fairly monocultural.
Oh yes.
Is there going to be a place in the third generation, second generation, for more multicultural connections in terms of the Pacific Islands?
Yes, quite possibly, yeah. I mean, my whole commitment and passion is multicultural church, but I totally understand the monocultural bent of those communities, But as the uniting church that we are a multicultural church. So I'm not very encouraging of this entrenched monoculturalism, But I just believe that as a multicultural community of faith, we can blend all these things and still not lose what I think is essential Tongan or Korean or Anglo,
Yeah, so the kind of the cultural identity that's within that. Yeah, so in a sense having many cultures together but retaining their sense of cultural identity within it. And would you see worship as being a fundamental part of how we can actually help to make that happen?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. Okay. And I know it can be done,
Yeah, because it has. You've seen it done in places.
And I've made it happen with my own practice as a multicultural practitioner.
So, in terms of that, do you see especially the young people? Because you were saying that some of the young people, there's a possibility for drift.
Yes.
What do you think would be the cause or the major cause of that drift?
Oh, it's absolutely to do with the alienation from not being able to understand the language, and so sitting through a whole Tongan service, if you're a young Tongan and you don't understand, that is really part of the alienation. And the usual traditional versus contemporary, what young Tongans see as contemporary is all Western, not necessarily contemporary Tongan, it's contemporary Western, Yeah. So the two is quite difficult to bring together if that's their perspective. And the first generation are thinking, okay, we might be able to accept contemporary Tongan, whatever that may be, but contemporary Western, that's just way too radical.
It's kind of a step too far.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in some ways, the way to go will be somewhere in between those two processes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And unfortunately, some of the drifters end up in like Hillsong type, contexts of worship.
Where there's no Tongan identity.
No, none at all, and just too different for Tongan traditionalists.
Yeah. And so very hard for them to kind of connect with in terms of in that.
Yeah.
I suspect that it creates a certain amount of conflict within those family groups and those family setups.
Yes, probably. I mean, parents feel a bit, sad and upset.
Yeah. Well, I think you've given us a good insight and certainly given us some background. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.